Hi everyone, this is the fourth video about the complete and detailed rules of Interstellar, the great Interstellar game by Phil Eklund and Justin Gray. And now that we've pretty much mastered the art of navigating our spaceship and developing all the technologies mankind will need to survive, we're going to turn our attention to a strange entity somewhere between the blob and the gelatinous cube. Let's call it the goo. In this game, the goo represents a cluster of hundreds of millions of tardigrades, those super strong microscopic bugs, enhanced and programmed using nanotechnology. The result is a strange self-replicating material with a certain kind of intelligence, a material that may be useful and the focus of numerous scientific experiments, but which can become a mortal danger if not completely mastered. And so, we begin with the unfortunately classic case of the scientific accident. You're setting up an experiment. You are tired, one wrong move, and it's a catastrophe. The goo escapes and spreads throughout the ship. In game terms, every time a cyborg, a big die, works on an experiment and gets a die roll strictly below his stress level, he makes a terrible error and the goo spreads throughout the ship. So, it can only happen if a cyborg, a human, is working on an experiment. There's no risk with avatars, and it is linked to stress. After two stressed disks, the risk appears. So, let's suppose green player has just made this roll. No matter what work cell card it is, the goo is accidentally released. And the first effect is that it kills all the people, avatars and cyborgs assigned to maintenance on the same section of the ship, on the same blueprint. So here the white avatar is eliminated. And note that the green, yellow and red cyborgs and avatars are not affected, at least not yet, even though they are also in the engine section. And as the work on the work cells takes place before the maintenance work, the accidental release of goo in the engine section will kill the white avatar and thus prevent the planned ignition of the engines. However, this does not affect the work cells of red and yellow players. Finally, we place a goo marker on the affected section. For now, until the end of this round, we'll leave it like this, but from next turn onwards, we'll have to fight the goo. Next turn, avatars and cyborgs can be assigned to the blueprint affected by the goo in order to fight the goo. In fact, any worker assigned to this blueprint will have to fight the goo. Maintenance operations linked to this section are no longer available. So, for example, here it is impossible to start the engines while there's goo. But that doesn't stop other avatars and cyborgs from being assigned to experiments work cells that are attached to the goo-infected section. And since the work cells are resolved right away, they still have a chance of success in the middle of a goo infection. And funnily enough, there can be no new goo accident if there's already an attack in progress in the same section. So here, even if green player gets a result lower than his stress, it doesn't change the situation and it doesn't kill the white and red characters who bravely set out to fight the goo. And the fight against the goo is resolved in the same phase, the work cell phase. It is a die roll on this table, the goo combat table, a table with two lines, and a large blue pawn shows which line to use. At the beginning of the game, the pawn is always on the yellow line, but for this example, we'll assume it's on the red line, which is the simplest. Players roll their dice with a result of 5. The white avatar is killed. It's not too serious though, as it will return on the next turn. He's just an avatar. But he misses his attack on the goo. With a result of 4, the red cyborg also misses, but he would have succeeded and killed the goo if he'd had an augmentation in the field of engines. Okay, if the goo is killed, remove the goo counter from the board and everything goes back to normal. The chief engineer who killed the goo gets the champion's medallion. If there are several candidates, the commander decides. Note that this medallion goes to the last player to have killed some goo. In other words, the last player to do so takes the medallion from its previous owner. On the other hand, if at the end of the phase the goo is still there, it starts eating whatever it can, and especially the work cells, the cards whose symbol matches the blueprint under attack. And it happens as soon as the work cell phase is over, so now. And there are two possible ways of getting to this point. Either characters have been assigned to the goo but have failed, this is what just happened in our example, or no one has been assigned to fight the goo. And in both cases, the result is that all the work cells matching the blueprint are destroyed, and it kills the avatars and cyborgs working on it. Then, with the goo satisfied, it stops for this turn. And you'll be living with goo in the engine section for another 12 years. Next turn, same thing. In fact, it's quite simple. As long as the goo is there, you have to fight it. And if you miss again, it has to eat again at the end of the work cell phase. And if it runs out of work cell cards, it eats the blueprint itself. It eats the whole engines section, it kills the avatars and cyborgs inside, and the blueprint's maintenance functions will no longer be available. No more action to ignite the engines in our example. It also eliminates the whole matching column in the marketplace. As a special case, if the goo attacks the battery blueprints and is not defeated by the end of the turn, instead of destroying the battery blueprint, it first destroys all the fuel remaining in the tanks. And only if there's no fuel left does it eliminate the blueprint itself. And in the end, as you can see, the damage is huge. And you learn from this story that when an area is attacked by the goo, it's not to be taken lightly. And it's strongly advised to send enough people right away to fight it off. You'll also learn that stress can have catastrophic consequences, since it was Cyborg's stress that started the attack. Okay, goo is bad, but actually not exactly. This mixture of tardigrade and nanotechnology is man-made, and believe me, it's not a design error. After all, you're going to need goo when you arrive on your interstellar destination. Remember, when you're exploring distant systems looking for a welcoming planet, you sometimes come across this type of indication, which means that to colonize it, you know you've got the water you need and all you have to do is bring along 2 domesticated goo. Here we go. Goo can be domesticated and is even very useful for terraforming the atmosphere of otherwise unbreathable planets. So, to domesticate goo, first you have to be in domestication mode, which means moving the blue pawn to the second line of the board. It's super easy, but requires a decision by the commander, the player with the sheriff star. It can be done during the navigation phase. The commander freely moves the blue pawn to line 1 or 2. Note that this is after the player's actions, maintenance and work cells, so it's something to plan ahead for the next turn. And then it happens exactly as we've just seen. But this time it's more difficult and the roll succeeds on a result of 1 or from 1 to 3 with the matching augmentation. and it's riskier as the cyborg dies on a result of 4 to 6. If domestication is successful and if it's a cyborg, he gains the matching augmentation if he doesn't already have it. And avatar or cyborg, whoever succeeds in the domestication role, flips the goo counter to its golden side and keeps it on his mat as a trophy. There's a total of 5 such proofs of domestication, one for each symbol, that are 5 trophies for colonizing planets at the end of the journey. Okay, this time you start to see the whole picture, but perhaps you find it a little strange. Because listen, in order to colonize a habitable planet, very often you'll need some domesticated goo. Okay, but at the very beginning of the process, goo appears by chance when a cyborg's voxel roll is lower than his stress. So what? He has to pretend to do research with a lot of stress and hope to fail his roll to summon some goo that he can then domesticate? In fact, yes, he can do it that way, and it would work. But obviously, this isn't the normal way of doing things. The most logical thing to do is to perform the slenderize action on the life support blueprint. Remember, it's called foam metal and requires 3 identical augmentations. And this unlocks a new maintenance action called Outbreak, which allows you to trigger at will a goo invasion in a section of your choice. Also, the weak boson experiment allows you to domesticate goo without any die roll, but it's a foolhardy experiment, so it depends on the nature of reality. And one character, Arduina, can also summon goo for domestication. These are some of the ways to provoke a goo invasion without having to wait for it to happen by chance. And here we are. At this point, you're becoming a specialist in the Exodus. You know how to pilot it and how to handle basic hazards. But beware, your mission is not only science. And there's a human dimension to your goals that shouldn't be overlooked. As we all know that the best engineered technology can fail miserably if entrusted to people who are a little too ambitious or jealous of their neighbors. So, it's time to look at the human factor. There are 12 humans on board. I should say 12 humans to be because they are frozen embryos stored in cryogenic jars, 2 by 2, 1 male, 1 female, each in their own color compartment. At the very beginning of the game, one of the 6 women is randomly selected to be awakened and assume the role of the Exodus first commander. And then she chooses the man she wakes up to assist her. She cannot choose the man from the same faction as her because any player of any color can only have 1 representative on board at any given time. In game turns, each player can only have 1 die in play. Here, red and white players have their big die in play, their cyborg, representing Meshkenet the midwife and Confucius the scholastic. And all the other players are represented by their small die, their avatar, a robot that takes care of their interest while their humans are only frozen embryos. And so why bother? Why don't we just defrost everyone in the first place? Well, mainly because once defrost, a human begins to age. Cyborg age is checked at the end of each round, at the end of each 12-year period, just before the reset phase. At the beginning of the cyborg's life, things are simple. The cyborg ages 12 years, his card is turned a quarter turn, Meshkenet the midwife therefore begins turn 2 at age number 2, so around 30. Next round is the same, age number 3, 42. And she finishes the next round in age number 4, 54. How time flies. At the end of the next turn, her card is flipped, she enters age number 5, and so far so good. Trouble starts when she ends a turn with her card already flipped. In this case, before increasing her age category, she must roll her die to see if she has some health issues. This is called attrition. Just look here, it says survive. We can see that at age number 5, she risks nothing since she survives on a score of 1 to 6. But from age number 6, 78, she has a 1 in 6 chance of dying. And then it gets worse, and at age number 8, 102, she has a 2 in 3 chance of dying. Note that at this point we can no longer flip her card. She remains stuck at age number 8 with the constant 2 in 3 chance of dying each turn. If she's lucky, her life aboard the Exodus may last quite a long time. Beware, stress, as we all know, can have bad effects on your health. The rule is simple: when making a attrition roll, a cyborg considers its age category increased by the number of stress tokens she has. Here, Meshkenet makes her survival roll as if she were in age category 7, 5 plus 2, and she dies on a result of 5 or 6. So that's it, that's life. Your cyborgs are going to die and you're going to replace them. The easiest way is to go to the fridge and take out a frozen embryo. It's a maintenance action on the jar's blueprint, of course, and very poetically called decant. Let's suppose that green player assigns his avatar to this action. In the maintenance phase, he uses 2 points of battery as indicated, and then he can choose from the jars which embryo he's going to wake up. He must choose an embryo of his own color. He cannot wake up another player's cyborg. So if he has a choice, it's between his male and his female cyborg. Let's suppose he chooses the man. He places him on his mat, then he picks up his large die and places it in the space marked age number 1. This cyborg, during these first years of its life, is not mature and therefore not directly useful. Children are not made to work aboard the Exodus. And at the end of the round in which it was born, when all cyborgs age to the next age category, this newborn cyborg remains in category number 1 and simply gets his die back. From the next turn, he is 18 and can do all possible actions. And that's not the way children should be brought up. Out of a freezer, the newcomer to the world, Che the communist, won't have had the childhood of his dreams, and especially he won't have benefited from his parents' education. To show that, he's given an orphan token, which he will keep for the rest of his life. And what does this change? Look, normally when a cyborg reaches age number 5, so the second half of his life, he earns a special power which is simply the power of wisdom. For example, Arduina from the age of 66 is able to summon the goo wherever she wants and prevent it from destroying the ship. Arduina can therefore be very useful in domesticating the goo the crew needs to terraform their future home planet. Okay, but if Arduina was defrosted from the jars, so if she's bearing the orphan token since childhood, well, she doesn't benefit from this power. No wisdom for orphans. And how do you avoid being an orphan? Well, I won't draw you a picture. Any woman in Interstellar can decide to have a child by natural means. Let's take Nanshi the Mimarobe, for example. She's Grey player's female cyborg. So, in the allocation phase, rather than assigning her die to a work cell or maintenance job, she can put her die on her own pregnancy box. she's now pregnant. And in fact, that means that during this 12-year period, she'll be raising her child. At the work cell phase, she must roll to see if everything went well. It's called pregnancy roll, and it depends on her age. No chance of failure at age number 1, and then it's downhill until age number 4. From age number 5, a woman can no longer have children. And whatever her age, if she scores a 6, whether the birth is successful or not, she receives a stress token. So if, for example, Nancy gets a 3 when she's 30, it's a success and she has a child stress-free. And from then on, I know it's not poetic, but it happens exactly like the decant operation. So first, Nancy chooses her child from among all the available cyborgs. That means all the cyborgs who are not currently adults in play on the ship. For example, Nancy can give birth to young Eris. And what's really interesting is that she can go and get her from the jars, but she can also draw her from the discard pile. In other words, Eris may have already been alive aboard the Exodus. She may have died, and thanks to this new birth, Nancy may decide to give her life a second time. And this is Nancy's choice. Purple player in our example has nothing to say. Eris, the newborn daughter of Nancy, will be represented by a purple die and will be played by the purple player. And note that Nancy cannot give birth to Hanno because he would be represented by a grey cyborg die, and this die is already used since it's Nancy's own die. No player can have 2 cyborgs of their color on the ship at the same time. And then, the newborn is not an orphan. She doesn't get the orphan token, so she'll earn her power of wisdom when she reaches half-life, that is, age category number 5. And please think about it, because it's very important. Giving birth to a new cyborg by the natural method allows you to overcome the limit of 12 frozen embryos. You'll find that the lifespan of your cyborgs will always be too short to do everything you want, and you only have 2 in the freezer. So it's very important to be able to get natural birth in between, and above all, women can continue the cycle ad infinitum if all this is well handled. And don't forget that in order to colonize a planet, at the very end of the journey, you must have a woman in your team. Now we are starting to get into the private lives of cyborgs, and it's time to turn our attention to the most important parameter of these private lives, stress. Stress is represented by red tokens that pile up on the player's mat. We've already seen all the events that create stress. We can summarize them here. When the engines are ignited, a stress disk for every cyborg who is awake. When a cyborg is doing research, depending on which line its work cell card comes from. When a cyborg rolls a 6 on a work cell roll. And finally on a 6 on a pregnancy roll when a mother is trying to give birth to a child. And the effect of this stress is first, a possible premature death on the attrition roll at the end of the turn. The age category is increased by the stress value. And also, the possibility of triggering a goo invasion if you roll below your stress on a work cell roll. So, without any doubt, stress is a real problem. First, because its consequences are serious, the death of a cyborg or the uncontrolled appearance of goo. But more than that, because the stress tokens pile up without many ways of getting rid of it. Note that stress is not attached to a cyborg, but directly to the player's mat. If Wofe the diplomat dies and is replaced by the birth of Siddhartha the priest, that doesn't change the stress, even if Siddhartha is in fact a newborn. And now, if you want to fight your stress, weapons are scarce. First, If the player no longer has any cyborg on board, at the reset phase, he loses one stress token. This is interesting because it means that stress doesn't go away so quickly, even without any cyborg in play. Note that during this time, the avatar is not affected by stress. He doesn't make attrition roll, and there's no risk of him provoking a goo invasion. And thus, how do you lose stress when your cyborg is awake? There's only one way: the sacred bonds of marriage. -1 stress point per turn for the married cyborgs. And this is 1 point less for the couple. So the two cyborgs married to each other have to decide between them which one will lose the stress point. And if they don't agree, that's funny, they gain 1 stress point each. Or they divorce immediately. In other words, they are no longer married. Fine, so what exactly is this marriage thing? First, as we've seen several times, there's a large political diagram in the middle of the game board. And to put it bluntly, it's not super useful, at least not to the extent of its size. Mainly, it's where players place the die that represent them, and it's also where you see the order of play always the same from grey to green. A sheriff star shows who the commander is. So, in the allocation phase, when it's his turn, and if he has a cyborg in play, a player can propose to his neighbor. As you can see, it's very specific. Only 2 awakened cyborgs can marry. You cannot marry an avatar or a frozen embryo. And the two must have affinities, which in game terms translate into being neighbors on the political diagram. In our example, only white and yellow players can marry. From that point, it's very simple. In his allocation phase, one of the two players, let's say white player, proposes marriage to his neighbor, yellow player, and if he accepts, he places his wooden ring between them to mark their union. And the benefits are immediate, which is that at the end of each turn, one of the two players loses 1 stress point, either white or yellow. And there's another more minor advantage. If one of the two has to give birth and roll a pregnancy die to see if everything's going well, the serenity of marriage means that the die can be re-rolled once if it fails. And I know it all sounds rather anecdotal, but don't overlook marriage. That 1 stress point per turn is well worth it, because don't forget, there's virtually no other way to get rid of it. Beware, there are matrimonial laws to be observed. First of all, you can only marry once. You can have 2 neighbors, but you have to choose one. Then there are other laws that depends on the commander. It's written on the board right next to the diagram. If the commander is grey, it's polygamy. You can marry both your neighbors at the same time. A player can be bound by 2 marriages and can profit from both. And this law allows marriage with the posthuman, which is normally forbidden. Red commander, exogamy, in which case the bride and groom lose 1 stress point per turn. They don't need to decide who will be the beneficiary. White commander, monogamy, divorce is forbidden. Usually, there's an automatic divorce, a breakup of the marriage, if one of the two wants to marry his other neighbor. Divorce also happens if a player is married to the commander and challenges the commander's decision. And so, that's not possible if the current marital law is the monogamy of white commander. The consequence being that a player married to the white commander under this marital law has no right to contest his decisions. Isn't it a wonderful world? Yellow commander, heterogamy, a cyborg can only marry a cyborg of the opposite sex. And this means that this law does not apply to other types of marriage. Purple commander, arranged marriage. Any marriage or divorce is only possible on the commander's decision. Green commander, polycule, no marriage is possible, so no one can lose stress through marriage. But under this law, any childbirth benefits from a possible reroll of the die. At this point, you should begin to sense that there may be social or political issues aboard the Exodus. And we can think of an inevitable problem linked to the very nature of the 6 philosophies represented by the 6 players. Opposite philosophies on the diagram are actually enemies. 3 pairs of sworn enemies: gray-yellow, individuality versus unity, red-purple, freedom versus authority, and green-white, honor versus equality. This means that if 2 enemy cyborgs are awakened at the same time at the end of a turn, during the reset phase, they both gain 1 point of stress. That being said, there is a commander on board, hopefully, but what are his abilities? We've already seen a few. First, the commander pilots the Exodus. During the navigation phase, he makes all the decisions. He decides which path the Exodus takes when there are several possible routes. When the engines are ignited, he decides whether to slow down or accelerate. And as we'll see later, he also has a range of special maneuvers that he can decide. He also chooses the strategy for fighting the goo: red to kill it, yellow to domesticate it. And also, as we've just seen, depending on its color, he enforces his marital law. Finally, every commander has some special abilities depending on his ideology. They are called regulations. These regulations can be used just after players have assigned their cyborg or avatar, but before any action. There are 3 possible commander abilities, each represented by a symbol. State security, the diamond symbol. The commander, if he has no nugget in his possession, can take a nugget from another player's mat. Collective authority, the carrot symbol. The commander can change the allocation of any workers, avatars and cyborgs whose owners have assigned them to selfish work cells. In other words, whenever someone wants to work for his own benefit, the commander can force him to play more collectively, and he can redirect him to where the Exodus and his commander need him. And finally, the state of emergency, the pawn symbol. The commander can reassign 1 worker, avatar or cyborg to a task he considers more urgent: a foolhardy experiment, the fight against some goo, or a maintenance task on a blueprint. And that's it. It's pretty cool to be the boss. These powers are highly asymmetrical and form the basis of politics and diplomacy on board. The commander's abilities, used at the right moment, can completely change the outcome of the mission. But of course, these commander's regulations, as seen by the other players, can sometimes seem like an abusive power. So, when the boss crosses the line, there's always a way to protest. The mutiny, let's call things by their name, takes place immediately, so at the end of the commander powers phase. Any players targeted by one of the 4 commanders' power can officially protest. I say 4 powers because that includes forced marriage in the case of a purple commander. And anyone who protests gains 1 stress point. It's no small thing to stand up to the captain's authority. Then players proceed immediately to a vote to elect a new commander or to re-elect the same one. On board the Exodus, the only thing that counts is moral value, what you've done actually for the good of mankind. In a nutshell, each player has 1 vote per medallion. and the outgoing commander gets an extra vote for his sheriff star. And that's all. That's not a lot of votes, and some players won't have any votes at all. Each player can vote for the awakened cyborg of their choice. This means that you can vote for a color, but not if that color is represented by an avatar. Voting is simultaneous, so for example, on the count of 3, everyone points a finger to who they are voting for. In the event of a tie, the player with the lowest number in the player order is elected. And that's it, the Exodus has a new commander or falls back on the same one, and the game goes on. And it's the same thing, the same vote, if the commander is killed. Whenever this happens, at the end of the phase in which the commander dies, the players vote for his successor. In the last video of my series, we'll see a detailed list of the 14 possible medallions. Take a look at it and make these medallions a part of your strategy. That way you won't be the victim of a tyrannical commander without enough votes to challenge his power.